U.S. facing potential debt default by June as Congress fails to agree on debt ceiling. The United States is at risk of defaulting on its debts for the first time in history if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling. The deadline is as early as June 1st, which adds urgency to ongoing negotiations between the White House and legislators, which have thus far failed to reach a compromise. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned in a letter to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and other top lawmakers that waiting until the last minute to suspend or increase the debt limit can cause serious harm to consumer and business confidence, raise short-term borrowing costs for taxpayers, and negatively impact the country's credit rating. Congress has little procedural wiggle room, as the House alone has just 12 legislative days left in May and is in recess this week. The debt limit must be raised or suspended in a way that provides longer-term certainty that the government will continue to make its payments, wrote Yellen, who could not definitively warn when the so-called X-date for default would begin. A nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office report in February estimated that default could begin in July, but the new June 1st deadline underscores the potential financial and political risks. Biden looks to meet with Congress, but partisan lines remain firm. President Joe Biden called all 4 congressional leaders to a May 9th meeting on the debt limit and invited them to discuss the urgency of preventing default, as well as how to initiate a separate process to address the budget and fiscal year 2024 appropriations. Biden stressed that Congress must take action to avoid default without conditions, but reactions from the 4 lawmakers quickly broke down along partisan lines. House Republican Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy touted a bill to raise the debt ceiling while enacting government spending cuts and reversing some of Biden's policies, while leading Democrats pushed for a clean bill to avoid default and called the Republican stance right-wing extremism that held the nation hostage. The U.S. can pay most, but not all of its bills with the tax and other revenue it takes in, and it must borrow the rest of the money. But Congress enforces a limit on how much debt the government can incur, and when that ceiling, currently set at about $31.4 trillion, is reached, lawmakers must increase it before the government can borrow more funds. The U.S. hit the current debt limit in January and has been employing extraordinary measures since then to keep its bills paid. The Treasury Department has also enacted some cutbacks, including contributions to employees' retirement plans. Experts warn of potential damage to the economy and global economic standing. Experts have warned of the potential damage to the economy if the U.S. defaults on its debts. Mark Zandi, the top economist at Moody's Analytics, testified in March before the Senate on the risk posed by a debt default, calling it an immediate threat to any optimism the economy can skirt recession in the coming year and a long-term threat to the nation's finances and economic growth. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell echoed this sentiment, stating that raising the debt ceiling was the only alternative to default. The risk of default has also raised concerns in financial markets. If the United States fails to meet its financial obligations, it risks damaging its global economic standing as the world's wealthiest nation. Republican calls for concessions on spending and the federal government's budget in exchange for raising the debt ceiling have been rejected by Democrats, who have insisted that the debt limit be raised without strings attached, as has happened before. Conclusion: the United States risks defaulting on its debts for the first time in history if Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling. The potential June 1st deadline has added urgency to negotiations between the White House and legislators, with little procedural wiggle room remaining for Congress. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has urged Congress to act as soon as possible to avoid serious harm to consumer and business confidence, raise borrowing costs, and harm the country's credit rating. The president has called for a meeting with congressional leaders to discuss the issue, emphasizing the need to act without conditions. The impasse has become increasingly politicized, with both parties digging in their heels on concessions. However, the consequences of failing to raise the debt limit are too high for either side to ignore. The United States risks damaging its global economic standing as the world's wealthiest nation, while financial markets would react very violently if the government's bills go unpaid. The risks posed by a debt default are too great for Congress to ignore, and both sides must work together to find a solution.